Our spirituality is a oneness and an interconnectedness with all that lives and breathes, even with all that does not live or breathe. Mudruru, 1938 to 2019. Mudruru was a First Nations Australian known for his novels, essays, and poetry. Mudruru lived for 15 years in India and Nepal. He spent 3 of those years as a Buddhist monk. Time and memory, perhaps the 2 most fundamental aspects of human existence. While it is very important to avoid generalizing about the longest continual culture on the face of the earth, over 50,000 years old, time and memory take on very unique dimensions in the spirituality of the First Nations people of Australia. Before Europeans arrived in Australia, the population of First Australians was split into 250 individual nations, many of which were in alliance with one another, and within each nation there existed separate, often related clans, from as few as 5 or 6 to as many as 30 or 40. Each nation had its own language, and a few had several. At the heart of any First Australian's conception of time is the Dreamtime, often translated in just 2 of the 250-plus First Nations languages as Tjukurrpa or Alcheringa. Among the many diverse Australian First Nations, there is a shared understanding of time and space as being intricately interwoven with the Dreamtime. In the Western worldview, time is mostly perceived as linear, marked by past, present, and future. However, within Australian First Nations cultures, time takes on a fundamentally different character. The Dreamtime explains how all that exists was created, and like all creation explanations, it tells the story of how nothing became something. Creation stories utilize symbolic narratives to explain how nothing became something, that is, how existence arose and how humanity originated out of nothingness. In the East, we find innumerable explanations of how existence came to be. In the West, we find almost as many creation stories from the distant past of ancient Mesopotamia to the Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. There are also what could be called scientific creation stories or explanations. The most popularly held one in the contemporary world currently being the Big Bang Theory. The Big Bang Theory repeats the pattern of all creation stories. That is, first there was nothing, and then there was something. All of these creation stories, East and West, also share another aspect. They all happen within a linear conception of time. They suggest a progression through time from nothing to something. The Big Bang Theory goes as far as to say that prior to the appearance of something from nothing, there was no time, thus rendering all questions of what was before the Big Bang incoherent. Across the 250 nations of the First Australians, there was a shared conception of time that was very different from that of the West's linear notion of time. This unique Australian First Nations conception of time, when applied to the creation story of the Dreamtime, makes for a very different understanding of creation than those of all the many other creation stories, East or West. If you would like to learn more about the spirituality of Australia's First Peoples, or any other spiritual topic, please visit Asangoham Books. You can find the link in the description of this video. The Australian First Peoples' conception of time is not linear. It is circular and finds its source in consciousness. Not as movement through consciousness, but as the different states of consciousness. Time, for the Australian First Peoples, across all nations and language groupings, is conceived as ontological states of consciousness. This is a very subtle conception of time that can be difficult for us to comprehend, as it suggests that actually there is no time as we have come to know it. This First Nations understanding of time, however, can open up a completely different and unique vision of creation stories and myths, including the creation story called the Big Bang Theory. Time, in the Australian First Peoples' understanding, does not move. Instead, it expresses itself either as visible or invisible, appearing or not appearing. Objects, events, even people, do not progress through time. Rather, they are either in an ontological, existing state, as appearing to consciousness in the gross form of the visible, or as appearing to consciousness in the far more subtle form of the invisible. And 3 important aspects are key to understanding the Aboriginal conception of time. 1. Nothing ever ceases to exist. 2. Nothing ever changes. All apparent objects only appear to consciousness differently as either gross, visible, or subtle, invisible. 3. Thus, everything exists now. A simple example may help. We might think to ourselves, I would like a peanut butter sandwich. The peanut butter sandwich exists. However, it appears to consciousness only in its invisible, subtle form as thought. I make the peanut butter sandwich, and of course it still exists. However, now it appears to consciousness in its gross, visible form. I eat the peanut butter sandwich. The sandwich continues to exist only now. It appears to consciousness again in its subtle, invisible form as memory. Nothing ever goes out of existence. Time, according to this understanding, is merely the illusion of movement of objects, events, animals, people, places, as they appear to consciousness as visible and invisible and back again, ad infinitum. It is important to note that in this understanding nothing ever actually changes form, for example from visible to invisible or invisible to visible. Rather, it only appears to consciousness as visible or invisible. Since the 1960s, it has become a common spiritual understanding in the West that there is only the now. Books from the 1960s, such as Ram Dass's Be Here Now, up to 1997's The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, have suggested that both the past and the future are only thoughts. Therefore, both the past and the future are non-existent, and all that really exists is the now. A now that can only be located as now because it is seemingly sandwiched between a non-existing past as memory and a non-existing future as projected thought. The Australian First Peoples' conception of time is a more nuanced and in many ways a more sophisticated understanding of time and therefore of existence itself. In this conception of time, the past and the future do exist. However, as we have seen, the objects of the so-called past and future appear to human consciousness in their subtle and invisible form. Therefore, in the Australian First Peoples' conception of time, there is no now, in the sense of there being a now sandwiched between a past and a future time. There are only differing ways presently in which always already existence shows itself to human consciousness. There is no need to be in the now, because there is not a now to be located between the non-existing past and futures, and then somehow clung to or to effortfully try to concentrate oneself in. Rather, in some sense, there is nothing but the now. In fact, it is an impossibility for anything to be outside the now. Thus, why would it be necessary for someone to be mindfully in the now if it is impossible to be out of the now? With this understanding, we may begin to see that the practice of mindfulness is predicated on a particular conception of time and of existence. Truly effective mindfulness is to realize a conception of time that is beyond the need to be mindful. That is to concentrate one's attention in the illusory notion of a now. The Australian First Peoples' conception of time is just such an understanding. With the understanding of this Australian First Peoples' conception of time, we can return to the creation stories of the Dreamtime with a deeper appreciation. These narratives, handed down through generations, explain the origins of the Australian landscape, its features, and all living beings. They serve as a cosmological framework that underpins the interconnectedness of all life forms and the land itself. These stories are not merely mythopoetic, they are living narratives that continue to inform all Australian First Nations spiritual practices, rituals, and ways of life. And because Dreamtime stories are not bound by the constraints of linear time, they are always present, always relevant. It is a time beyond time, a realm where the past, present, and future coexist in a continuous cycle of creation and existence, of the visible and the invisible. The stories of the Dreamtime are also inextricably linked to the landscape and to what Australian First Peoples called songlines. Songlines are also known as dreaming tracks. They are intricate pathways that crisscross the vast Australian landscape, both on the land and in the sky, connecting sacred sites and significant locations. These invisible but deeply ingrained songlines are encoded with songs, stories, and chants passed down through generations, containing information about the land's topography, flora, fauna, and ancestral narratives. As we will see in more detail in a moment, songlines serve as a complex and multifaceted mnemonic device, preserving a wealth of knowledge, history, and cultural wisdom. Thus, songlines are not just roots, but living narratives that guide ceremonies, rituals, and the understanding of one's place in the world. Perhaps, most importantly, songlines are linked to the singing of the Dreamtime stories of the creation of the earth, or the story of how nothing became something. Interestingly, this understanding of the Australian Aboriginal conception of time can help us resolve some of the contradictions that we find in Western scientific theories of creation, such as the Big Bang theory. The most common reaction to the Big Bang theory is, but what was before the Big Bang? That question can only arise from a certain conception of time, a linear conception of time. From an Australian First Peoples conception of time, the Big Bang, like the Dreamtime creation stories themselves, is not an event that happened in the past, but rather an event that is happening right now. From this point of view, the Big Bang is happening now, or presently, in every moment. In every moment, nothing is becoming something. We see this idea reflected in the Buddhist Heart Sutra, emptiness is form is emptiness, as well as in the 2nd century Mahayana Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna's admonition to neither land in nothing or something, but rather to realize reality as the coincident arising of nothing and something simultaneously. Thus, understood from this Australian First Peoples conception of time, the Big Bang theory is actually a description of now. The question, what was before the Big Bang, becomes irrelevant, as there can be nothing before or after, now, or what might be better named as this. There never is, nor could there ever be, something outside of this. Linear time is merely an illusory thought dream. Can you point to anything that exists outside of this? No, because a reality outside of this is an impossibility. This is the deeply profound understanding of the Australian First Peoples' spirituality and cosmology. The art of memory. These Dreamtime stories did not merely transmit knowledge of how the world was, or rather is created in each and every moment. They were also, for the Australian First Peoples, a vast archive of information, from navigation and ecological knowledge to laws and spiritual understandings. As the first Australians walked the songlines through the Australian landscape, the songs that they sang were linked and associated with particular features of that landscape. These songs and stories were ways of memorizing vast amounts of information about the stars, the land, the weather, the plants, the animals, and much, much more. This method of memorization has parallels in ancient Greek culture. The ancient Greeks used what they called memory palaces to memorize incredible amounts of information. The memory palace, also known as method of loci, was an ancient Greek mnemonic strategy. The Greeks would mentally associate pieces of information with specific locations within a familiar place, such as a palace, house, or even a fictional landscape setting. The individual creates a mental map of this place and imagines walking through it, placing key information at various locations along the route. When the need to recall the information arises, retracing the mental journey through the memory palace triggers the retrieval of associated details. In this way, the ancient Greeks were able to memorize vast amounts of information. This was particularly useful during a period prior to the arrival of writing, in which Greek culture was completely an oral tradition. The first Australians used songlines in almost the exact same way, but in ways which often covered thousands of kilometers. However, it was not only by associating knowledge with landscape that they remembered vast amounts of information, but also by using a technique known to all contemporary memory experts, that is, by using exaggerated and outrageous stories. Today's memory experts use the linking of exaggerated stories to memorize vast amounts of information. For example, a memory expert might use exaggeration to remember a list of historical dates through exaggeration by imagining a giant history book with dates so huge they fill the entire room, or create an outrageous story where historical figures ride giant dates as if they were horses racing through time. For example, the image of Napoleon riding a massive 1812 date into Russia. By utilizing these vivid and exaggerated mental images, a memory expert associates the information with memorable and absurd visuals, thus making it much easier to recall. The Australian First Peoples' Dreamtime stories were utilized in a similar way. While understood by First Australians as describing an actual reality, these Dreamtime stories can also be seen as extremely memorable because of their exaggerated and even outrageous narratives and characters. By walking through the landscape associating knowledge with various natural features and singing the Dreamtime stories of exaggerated and outrageous characters and narratives, a method very close to ancient Greek memory places and contemporary masters of memory, the first Australians memorized an almost unbelievable amount of information and knowledge. Anthropologists estimate that the knowledge of the natural environment, plants, animals, weather, landscape, etc., that an initiated Australian First Nations male held was equal to memorizing the entire 20 volumes of the Oxford English Dictionary twice. That is equal to memorizing 42,000 pages of information. We could say that as far as the natural environment is concerned, first Australians were walking, talking, breathing Google search engines. Today we are rightly concerned with the destruction of vast amounts of our natural environment and biodiversity. It is important to recognize too that with the destruction and loss of many of the world's first peoples, we have lost not only incredible reservoirs of knowledge, but also the incredible capacities and abilities that are part of first peoples' ways of knowing globally. Australian First Peoples' conception of time, embodied in the Dreamtime, presents a profound alternative to the linear understanding of time prevalent in Western thought. Their circular ontological view of time challenges us to re-evaluate our understanding of existence itself. It emphasizes that everything exists now, and that the past and future are not separate entities, but different manifestations of this continuous present. This perspective, deeply rooted in their spirituality and cosmology, provides a unique lens through which to view creation stories like the Big Bang Theory. The Dreamtime stories, intertwined with the songlines, serve as both a spiritual framework and a comprehensive mnemonic device, preserving vast amounts of knowledge, history, and cultural wisdom. In recognizing the richness of this Australian First Peoples' knowledge and connection to the environment, we gain a deeper appreciation for their cultural heritage and ecological wisdom, reminding us of the importance of preserving both the knowledge and the global diversity of all First Peoples' ways of knowing.